Today, I fulfill the dream of having my dad join me in the shop to build the most important piece of furniture in my life. But in the end, a stupid mistake turns it into a complete nightmare. Meet my dad. He's not a woodworker, but last summer he and my mom came over from 7,000 miles away to visit, and I had the idea to build the dining table of our new house together. Not only it would be a great bonding opportunity, but the result would be something we'd always cherish and remember, even when they're not around. The table design is a chunky and modern version of a trestle style table with two solid legs and a center stretcher, as well as a top that looks pretty thick, but it's accomplished in a smarter way than having to spend thousands of dollars on 10-quarter white oak. You'll see what I mean in a minute. After carefully selecting the boards for the top of the table, my dad has his first experience with the miter saw. He cut the boards to length, and since they were all over 8 inches wide, I had to rid them on the bandsaw so they could fit in my jointer. The final width of these boards would be about 6¼ inches, but I like to leave them as wide as possible at this stage, so I can have more options when I finally decide where I want them to go. The boards were then face jointed. Some of them took many passes, so we checked the thickness to make sure that we're still okay. There was a ton of milling on this one. The top started at 6¼ and the base at 8¼ so I had to stop a couple times to empty the new dust collector bin. Speaking of dust collection, you might have noticed the shop looks a little different. That's because we moved. The business outgrew the 1.5 car garage we had before, and we found a new place with a 900 square foot detached shop. It's got a mezzanine, a separate gate, 2 huge doors, and for me the winner, a mini split. I've been loving it here, but there's a ton of shop projects needed to make it more efficient, so stick around for those. What you see me doing here is I'm ripping the edge boards for the tabletop. Remember how I said that I'd make the top thicker without needing 10-quarter stock? I'm using the fold method. One stays on top, the other glues underneath, everything looks seamless. You'll see in a moment. Okay, this was interesting. For client projects, I use my best judgment to design the grain design on the top, but this has many clients. This was a family thing, so I brought everyone in the shop, and after an incredible amount of time, 37,000 shuffles, we finally settled on the winner. I'm glad I did that though, because for me, I would have hidden some knots, but my wife wanted them because she thinks it's cool. Of course, the obligatory proud family photo, and let's keep going. Now we're getting prepped for the initial glue up of the top, so I edge join all of the boards using the infallible in and out method, and my dad has a chance to try the mighty Domino jointer. I didn't say anything at the time, but I think he really enjoyed the famous hip thrust technique. I need to tell Jason his creation is reaching very unexpected audiences. If you've ever glued up a panel like this tabletop before, you know it's really challenging to keep the boards flat when applying clamping pressure because they tend to bow up even if you use clamps on the top and the bottom. So in order to minimize this top is going to be glued up in 2 stages. You're seeing the first stage where we glue up 2 halves independently first. Not only you minimize the bowing issue, but you also get a much more relaxing experience that way. We use the Rockler panel clamps for the second half, which are really cool because they apply pressure in the horizontal and vertical directions. My dad was pretty impressed at how flat the panel was. Out of clamps, I realized that my wife wanted the knots to be showcased and I hadn't addressed them, so before the second stage of the glue up, I decided to fill them, and for that I'm using black epoxy. And as the epoxy cured, we switch gears and start focusing on the base. As I mentioned before, the base would be made out of solid white oak, so the first thing we needed to do was to start milling the 8-quarter boards. After my dad cut them roughly into the lengths of the legs, I ripped them roughly to the widths of the legs, and we joined and planed them to a little over 1.5 inches thick. And in case you're wondering why so many parts, it's because we had to essentially make 8 individual blanks, composed out of 3 boards each so that we could laminate them together to make 4 sub-leg assemblies. I know it's a lot, and if you're confused, keep watching. It will all come together at the end. Okay, a little tip that I want to share. I need to cut my table legs to be 29.25 inch, and I need to use my Crosscuts Sled to do that. I don't have my miter station set up to do that correctly yet, and I feel like the table saw will always give me a very precise cut. So the way to do that is usually using the Crosscuts Sled, but my Crosscuts Sled is only 21 inches, so I cannot use my stop block. So the way I do this is I set my fence to 1 inch more than what I need the length to be. And then I use one of these 1, 2, 3 blocks that have all of these holes on the sides. And this is very helpful because what I can do is I can set up a stop block on the side of my fence like this and use one of these fence clamps. The cool thing about this guy is this thing actually fits perfectly inside one of these holes. So you can go ahead and just lock it in place like that. Then now what you have is you have a 1 additional inch that you can use as a block. So when you cut your piece, you can just butt it up against here, and now I know the distance between here and the actual blade is exactly 29.25, which is what I need. The benefit of that is that now once you start cutting, once the blade starts touching this piece, the fence is not a factor anymore. So now you're going to have a very, very clean and safe cut. So here's one of the A blanks I mentioned. My dad and I are checking the grain orientation and layout so that the table looks its best from every angle. Oh, and I said this was a family thing, so even Bella wanted to inspect it. I think she's okay with it. By the way, spending the time to configure the boards in the best way like we just did might seem a little excessive, but I truly believe this is one of the main things that differentiate a more advanced woodworker from a beginner. I think that being intentional with the smallest details creates a sense of quality that sometimes it's hard to articulate, even if the design is simple. Once the A blanks came out of clamps, we needed them perfectly flat to avoid gaps later. But they were too wide for my jointer, and my planer leaves a little bit of snipe, so I used a little trick. I run a sacrificial board of the same thickness first, and then butt each blank right against each other before it. That way the rollers stay engaged and the planer never gets a chance to snipe. You want another example of a detail that's not immediately obvious but makes a difference. After all that work matching the blanks, the last thing I wanted was misalignment during glue up. I used the Domino with the TSO BigFoot base. It's rock solid compared to the stock Festool one. That combined with the Domino tabs gives it incredible precision, and it's one of those small details that you just feel in the final piece. There's a trend in modern interior design and furniture called quiet luxury, which prioritizes high quality materials, expert craftsmanship, and timeless designs, which I relate to. I'll talk more about it in a future video, but that's what I'm going for here. Here we're laminating the blanks into the leg sub-assemblies, and for this I'm using clamps. For this project I did not have a vacuum bag available, so I had to use a ton of clamps and a little bit of MacGyvering to get even clamping pressure across the whole surface. To finalize the leg assemblies, I run the edges through the jointer to clean up one side from glue squeeze and rip the other side to the final width on the table saw. Now it was time to get the two halves of the tabletop glued up into one wider board. I'll preface this by saying I went into this thinking it was going to be easy. I thought to myself, it's one edge, what could go wrong, right? Well, as soon as we started applying clamping pressure, the center started bowing up, enough to turn the top into a potato chip if I ignored it. I should have known better and prepped Cauls or maybe even alternating clamps top and bottom, but once the glue was on, there was no going back. A little panic ensued. I had to improvise fast. I grabbed the cutoff from the top to use as a caul and tried clamping it to the workbench, but the MDF panel on my Bora base wasn't holding anything. So I clamped the MDF to the base first, and then clamped the caul to the MDF. And that worked perfectly. A bit of tape kept it from sticking to the top, and we used the plywood scrap in the middle to help spread the pressure. Crisis averted, and lesson learned. Now, I'll admit I was still a little bit nervous about it, but then we did a final test with a straight edge after the glue was dry and confirmed it was all good. With that stress out of the way, now it was time to clean up the cured epoxy from the top, and for this I like to use a combination of a makeshift router jig and then a card scraper to give it a final touch. What I'm going to show now is how I shape the top to its final dimension, as well as I create that thick effect through the folding method. So I mark where the center of the top is, and from there I measure half of that total length to one of the sides. That mark gives me where the table ends, and everything beyond that will be folded underneath the table. Then I use the only tool for the job, my TSO square attached to my track saw rail. There's just no other way you can get a perfectly square cut like this. You'll notice I'm not even using a Makita or a Festool rail for this. The square is really what makes the difference here, and if you're thinking about investing in something like this, get the square and maybe save on the rail if you must. TSO has an improved version of the one I'm using, and for the benefit you get, it's a no-brainer. And yep, I do have an affiliate link in the description for it in case you want to help the channel and purchase it for yourself. So that final cut is the lip that will be folded underneath the table on that side. And after admiring how clean the cut was, I had to chop a little leftover piece from the edge boards and clean it up with the chisel, which is always satisfying when you have it sharp. With the table cut to final size, now it's time to see how the lips are attached to the bottom of the table. The end grain is the storyteller in making sure that it does not look like you have a lip in there, so I took my time matching the boards and used a lot of clamps to avoid gaps. You may also notice there was a little check that split the lip after I cut it, but a little glue up fixed it, it was just cosmetic. With the first lip in place, I needed to do a final cut of the lip that would go across the length on the table, so I measured it and ripped it on the table saw. The important part here is to run the side that will be showing against the fence so that when you put it together, you won't lose that grain continuity from top to bottom. I also added a 1/16 or so to the width so that it could be proud of the top and I can flush cut later on. Now, it can only have so many clamps, right? And I didn't have enough to go around in one pass, so I had to wait for the glue to dry on the first two sides and then I did the last two. A huge vacuum bag here would actually save us so much time, but we got it done. And the final and satisfying step was to use a chunky 1/2 inch flush trim bit to remove the excess from all of the sides. I always like to use a compression bit for these situations, especially when I'm faced with end grain. There's a link to the one I use in the description. And after a bunch of sanding, the top was ready for finish. Okay, so to recap, we have the top and the two sides of each leg completed, so we now need to mill the boards for the stretcher that would connect the two sides of the table. For that, I'm also cutting in half and laminating an 8/4 board to get a little over 3 inches in width and height. And because grain continuity was important here as well, I'm using a domino to ensure that it wouldn't slip during glue up. Quick tip, I always use Cauls when clamping laminations like this. They not only protect the surface, but also spread pressure more evenly by increasing the distance between the clamp faces. That's a very common technique used by bent laminators exactly for that reason. And sometimes they need a little persuasion to be removed. Another quick tip, as you can see, there was a little material that needed to be flush trimmed here. For these situations, I like to use the mighty and simple L fence. I just aligned the blade with the edge of the fence and run your reference side against it. It was clean, safe, and dead accurate. It's one of my favorite jigs in the shop. Once that was done, I used the planer to get both sides to be exactly 3 inches, and I cut to length using the miter saw. Next, I needed to cut a 1/4 inch recess on the bottom and sides of the stretchers on both sides to have a registration point to make the glue up of the legs be more precise and stronger. And for this, I'm going to show you a technique that I don't see explained much on YouTube, but that makes this kind of joinery extremely tight and precise. First, I get the exact thickness of the leg and transfer it to the stretchers using a caliper. The key is to make a physical mark, not just a visual one. Then I place my marking knife on that first mark, bringing my square to it, and then extend it across the surface. Using that, I transfer the line to the other two sides with the same knife and square technique. Once everything is marked, I drop the knife into one of the lines, bring the square to the cut side, and position a square scrap piece as my routing template, securing it with the double-sided tape. Then I repeat the same for the opposite side, and I'm ready to shape the mortise with the template bit. A little test fit, perfect. I think I made my dad proud on this one. The last piece of the puzzle for the legs to be completed was the small piece that would connect the two leg sub-assemblies and receive the stretcher on top. So after milling them to rough dimensions, we needed to determine the exact width of the piece, and for that we're using referential measurements. We took the distance between the mortises on the stretcher using a scrap piece clamped to one of the sides and a marking gauge transferred to the piece, and again used that physical mark as reference on the table saw. And that created a super accurate cut. Then all that was left to do was to cut both pieces to length using a stop block on my miter saw. It's been quite a journey, but we're finally at the last stage of building the legs, the final glue up. I'm using a large domino here to connect both parts for maximum strength. First, I align everything, mark the locations, and cut the mortises. You might notice I don't own the regular size domino. That's because with a few Seneca Woodworking adapters, not sponsored, I can make mortises for any size. So if you're deciding which domino to buy, my vote is get the XL with these adapters. Best of both worlds. And because things were super aligned on the bottom side, I just ran both of them against my fence on the table saw and cross-cut the legs to final size so they would be exactly the same size. Then a little bit of sanding, well, a lot of sanding, and the legs were ready for finish. Now, I did mention this before, but the stretcher, and only the stretcher, would be black. So we needed to pre-finish all components completely before the final glue up of the base. Now, I know that there's a small number of people out there with very strong reactions about some pieces being finished black in my previous videos, and to those I say, make your voice heard, leave your comments. The engagement helps the channel. And for everybody else, I really like this black. I used Rubio Precolor Easy Intense Black, followed by a Rubio Oil Plus 2C Black. It looks really sophisticated and natural, and I think it will look great with the lighter finish of the rest of the table. Now, that part was interesting. I was extremely convinced I wanted to use Rubio Monocoat Cotton White for the rest of the table, and frankly, it looked really good in white oak. The cerused effect it creates, filling the white oak pronounced grain, is really unique, and really it was kind of the vibe that we wanted for the table. But this may or may not be the finish that we have on the final piece. I guess stay tuned. To complete the base, we just needed to glue up the stretcher to the two legs, so I carefully applied glue on the legs and dropped the stretcher in. I was really happy at how well they fit and how cool everything was looking so far. Next, we needed to finish the top, and I'll say there was a lot of work. I'm glad my dad was there to help. You really want to ensure you start wiping off the excess within 15 minutes or so. And I don't think that I would have been able to do it if I was by myself, even though I used an old random orbital sander with a white Scotch pad attached. I really needed one of those huge buffing machines like Cam has. Spoiler alert, I got one, but not in time for this build. As we got close to what I thought was the end of this build, I started thinking how cool it was that we were making something together that would stay in the family forever. And well, my mom and dad were leaving the next day at this point, and I realized we needed to use this table before they leave, even if it wasn't completely ready yet. They don't come to visit that often, and we needed to celebrate. But since we still had a few hours left to work on it, we marched ahead and got it as close to finish as we could. That meant trying to add the brackets to the legs and hopefully attaching them to the top within the time we had. I've used a leg bracket I found from Mack, which has a lot of possibilities of a hose in all directions, and that allows for it to be attached to the leg and then use the oblong hose on the top to allow for wood movement. I used 5mm epoxy here to fix the wood inserts into the legs, since it would be going into end grain, and a jig to ensure that the inserts would go straight into the legs. If you've ever tried to do this by hand, you know how challenging it is. If you're interested, let me know and I'll include some more details in a future video. At this point, we were racing against time, but we needed to make the recess on the top to accommodate the brackets, and for that we needed to position the table exactly where we needed. And my friends came over to help with this since this table is extremely heavy, coming at 300 pounds total. I marked where I wanted the brackets to go and proceeded with the routing of the recess. First, I needed to route a deeper recess that would house the heads of the bolts that were attached to the brackets on the legs. And for that, I quickly designed a diamond-shaped thing, which I then cut with my shaper origin and the plate. Then I used the template that came with the brackets and cut a shallower recess in the same thickness of the brackets using a pattern bit. And since everything was already finished, I applied some de-wax shellac on the recess to protect it from humidity changes and prevent future issues. The last thing we were hoping to do was to drill the holes on the bottom of the table to accommodate the inserts, but we really only had time to mark them. My friends had to go, and my mom and wife were preparing the final dinner of the 2 weeks they spent with us. But that's okay. I thought we could finish the rest after they leave in like 2 minutes the next day. Or could I? We wanted to use the table to celebrate these amazing 2 weeks together, but because it wasn't fully ready, I thought about setting it up in the shop and have a dinner in there. And everyone loved the idea. So we set music, champagne, amazing food, laughter, and had a really memorable time. But that, my friends, was not the end of it. 2 minutes, I said. I can finish this in 2 minutes. My friends were over to help me, and this is what I tell them. Yep, I drilled through the top and ruined the whole thing. Okay, this sucks, but as with some mistakes I made, sometimes there's an opportunity to make things better than the original plan, and this is going to be the case with this tabletop as well. The reason why is because I feel like the finish that I applied on it was not exactly what we were looking for the room that we're going to put this in. Had I not made this mistake, I would probably think twice about refinishing this table, but now I'm actually going to have to at least the top. So I'm going to go ahead and refinish the whole table. So the next steps now are going to be sanding the whole table, fixing the mistake, and then reapplying the finish so that we're ready to assemble it and install it in the room. So let's get to it. Okay, the issue with a finish like this in white oak is that once it's in there, it's really hard to sand because the grain is deeper, and in order to sand it off, you have to really bring the big guns. Enter the Rotex. That made the job somewhat easier, but it still was a lot of work. And of course, the stretcher was a different color, so I had to be really careful not to damage it. And the other challenge was trying to remove the finish in between the leg assemblies, but I was able to get it done with a good card scraper. Now let's fix the hole. I'm going to use my Shaper Origin to do two things. One, I'm going to determine the exact diameter of this hole by probing it so that I can get a very high degree of precision. And then I'm going to use the Shaper again to cut a face plug out of a piece of scrap that came from the same table. That way I know exactly what the face is going to look like, and then the diameter of it is going to fit exactly perfect in there so I don't have any gaps. After the plug was done, I applied some glue to it and to the table and carefully positioned it to match the grain direction as best as I could. And then I used a piece of scrap white oak to help tap the plug in until it was seated completely flush. Finally, I added some glue to the edges and sanded it without the vacuum attached to it. And the end result was almost imperceptible. I was really happy with it. I mentioned we didn't like the finish before, so instead of the more whitish color of the Rubio Cotton White, we opted for the Rubio Mist, which actually matched the color scheme of our house much better, with a little more of a creamy, natural tone. And after all the laughter, the long hours, and the one heartbreak that nearly ruined it all, the table was finally ready. I can't quite put into words what this piece means to me. Yes, it looks beautiful in our new dining room, but what moves me the most is knowing that the foundation of our family's next chapters was built on the tables of our past. And maybe someday, future generations will gather around this very one, adding their own stories to it. This is more than a table, it's a piece of our family's history, and I'll treasure it for as long as I live. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.